Directly into the mic, yeah. Unidirectional, for sure.
Probably not. So that's what they were complaining about.
Okay. Oh, I see. Okay. You want to take this out of the way as well?
Are you good? Is it filled with gin?
It might be.
Hey, Joe.
Angela, do you have an order you want to send?
No, but I would say we start with this one. Then I wanted to
I'll
before
be-
Sandra. Or Sandra before you.
Yeah, I'll put her on the right of the...
But feel free, there's more water somewhere.
Okay.
We're just checking on you.
This way?
No, but I'm just saying, how's a couple times on that?
Hello, Sandra. I'm Paul. Dylan. Nice to meet you. I'm IOM. I'm sorry? Oh, the Underground Railway? Yeah. No, I've taken to carrying dried biscuits, and just leaving a little trail to follow on the way there and back. Because, although it was a relatively good sense of direction, I've got myself lost a couple times already.
I just ran into your
Yeah, we'll bring this one up.
Okay. I'm not. No, I'm based in. I'm actually in James.
We're gonna have to squeeze it.
We're our meeting.
We do this family stuff.
take it in one hand and start belting it out like a rock star.
I've been here 18 hours. I got an instrument.
And Amy, just careful with your head, because we're at a tight table. Are you in or no?
I'm in
Yeah.
here, right?
Yes. You should be closest.
Do I just stand up here or there? Do I sit?
No, you can sit if you want. I'll introduce you standing.
Okay, good. And are you introducing everyone or am
No, I'm introducing you.
Oh,
I'm just introducing the morning. And believe me, my introduction will be about a second and a half.
okay.
So
We
no
need
worries.
Jocelyn.
We're just waiting.
Where is Jocelyn? Does anyone have a pen I could borrow? An extra pen?
I have one outside. Maybe Angela. Is that all right? Angela?
Do you have an extra pen? Do you have an extra pen? Do you have an extra pen?
Pen, yeah.
I think Angela may have one.
Here you go. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being with us this morning as we looked at from camps to communities. We now move on in the program to that part of from data to stories. So the balance of it really is, you know, we looked at the architectural side, but now, as we all know, the work that we do within the humanitarian sector can be helped or hindered by the role of the media and by the stories that we tell. I am thrilled to introduce as our moderator today, Amy Goodman, the noted author, investigative reporter, and host of Democracy Now!, everybody's favorite news forum. So I know you didn't come for me. I know you came for Amy and for these panelists. So I won't get in the middle of it. Amy, it's over to you.
Okay. Well, it's really a great honor to be with you all today. I was also trying to tune into the live stream this morning as the previous panels were going on, and I'm really looking forward to speaking with all of you and hearing the work you do. I am in awe of each of you. I was asked to say a few words before the panel, and I thought, what better way than to start the way we do every day on Democracy Now!, and that's with the news headlines. But first, how many of you know Democracy Now!, the daily, grassroots, global, unembedded, independent, international investigative news hour? We've been on for 23 years on 1,400 public television and radio stations around the world, and and also online at democracynow.org. We originally came out of Pacifica Radio, which was founded in 1949 by a war resistor named Lou Hill. When he came out of the detention camps, he said, there's got to be a media outlet that's not run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists. And that's how Pacifica was born. As George Gerbner, the late dean of the Annenberg School of Communications at University of Pennsylvania would say, not run by corporations that have nothing to tell and everything to sell that are raising our children today. The first station, KPFA in Berkeley, 1949, KPFK in Los Angeles, 59, our station in New York, WBAI in 60, 1977, WPFW in Washington, and KPFT in the Petro Metro of Houston went on the air in 1970. That's a historic station because within a few weeks, the Ku Klux Klan strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blew it to smithereens. They rebuilt quickly, They went back on the air in a few weeks, and the Klan strapped 15 times the dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blew it up again. I think it was in the middle of Arlo Guthrie singing Alice's Restaurant, which I thought is a good song. But anyway, it then took months to rebuild, and this phoenix rose from the ashes in January of '71. KPFT, the national media, is there. Arlo Guthrie comes into Houston to finish his song live on the air, and it's been broadcasting ever since. I can't remember if it was the Grand Dragon or the Exalted Cyclops, because I often confuse their titles. But he said it was his proudest act. And I think that's because he understood how dangerous independent media is. Dangerous because it allows people to speak for themselves. And when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, whether it's a Syrian refugee who we interviewed in the jungle in Calais in France during the UN Climate Summit, we took a train up to speak to the thousands of refugees, I dare say a number of them climate refugees. Whether it is a woman in Yemen whose sister was blown up because of a US drone strike on a wedding party. Whether it's a child in Afghanistan or an uncle in Iraq. When you hear someone speaking from their own experience, I'm not saying you'll agree with them. I mean, how often do we even agree with our family members? But it makes it much less likely that you'll want to destroy them. I think that understanding is the beginning of peace. The media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. Instead, all too often, it's wielded as a weapon of war. And that's what we have to challenge. The reason the Klan wanted to destroy Pacifica is because when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, it breaks down the caricatures and the stereotypes that fuel these hate groups. It breaks down the caricatures and stereotypes that allow you to separate yourself from that person. Instead, you say, oh my gosh, that Palestinian child sounds like my baby. That Israeli grandmother sounds like my bubba. And suddenly, we care about what's happening. And I really think that is absolutely critical. The media laying the groundwork facilitates what you all are doing, because when there is a political will, there is no question there is a way to deal with all of these issues, and the magnificent both actual plans you've laid out and your dreams for future plans for how people can be dealt with more humanely as they are displaced either inside their own countries or traveling all over. That's the background of Democracy Now! A news station picks us up every week somewhere in the world. So I just thought I'd start how we start every day, and that's with headlines. And how astoundingly, in a way, every headline links to refugees. So this one directly. The new UN report finds nearly, this was our yesterday headline, a new UN report finds nearly 71 million people were displaced last year by war, persecution, and other forms of violence. The number is more than 2 million people higher than last year, represents a jump of 65% from a decade ago. Nearly 26 million refugees were recorded in 2018, over half of them under the age of 18. Of these, less than 100,000 were resettled. Over 41 million people worldwide internally displaced, and 3.5 million were registered as asylum seekers. These numbers, I'm sure, you are all quite familiar with. Today's headlines from the top, how they link. Our top story today, President Trump reportedly approving, then abruptly calling off military strikes targeting Iran Thursday night. New York Times reporting U.S. warplanes were already in the air, ready to attack when Trump called the plan off. He'd initially okayed the strikes as retaliation for the Iran downing a U.S. drone. Iran maintains the drone had entered its airspace, while the U.S. claims the drone was in international waters. Trump's response to the first attack on the drone was to say, Iran made a big mistake. This drone was in international waters, clearly. We have it all documented, he said. It's documented scientifically. not just words, and they made a very bad mistake. If only he respected science. Would we be in the situation we're in today with the UN, with the US pulling out of, among other things, the UN Climate Accord in just this week, eviscerating yet another regulation around coal emissions in the United States? And just in the last few weeks, the Department of Energy announcing they will no longer use the word methane, they will call it freedom gas, and one of the top officials at the Energy Department saying, we are spreading molecules of freedom around the world. I want to move on to today's second headline. The Republican-led Senate voted yesterday to block the sale of billions of dollars worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Key backers of the bipartisan bill included Republican Senator Lindsey Graham and Democrat Bob Menendez. The House is also expected to pass the bill, but President Trump's threatening to veto the legislation. His first veto was also around this. And why does this matter? Why does it link to everything that you do? Because we're talking about the use of weapons by these regimes in Saudi Arabia and the UAE to bomb Yemen back to the Stone Ages, the worst humanitarian catastrophe in the world, and a British court ruling that British arms sales to Saudi Arabia are unlawful because the government did not consider whether they would be used to commit serious violations of international humanitarian law. The court's decision came in a case brought by the Campaign Against Arms Trade, which cited Saudi Arabia's use of British arms in its devastating war in Yemen. Andrew Smith, a spokesperson for the group, celebrated the ruling. He said, what this ruling makes clear is that for far, far too long, the UK government has looked the other way as tens of thousands of people have been brutally killed in the most devastating humanitarian crisis in the world. And then there's the federal court that ruled Thursday that the Trump administration can go ahead with plans to strip federal funding known as Title X for Planned Parenthood and other women's health clinics that refer patients for abortion or even mention abortion as an option. The so-called domestic gag rule would threaten health care for millions of women who rely on Title X health centers for primary and preventive care. And then we move on to migrant children in the United States. Democracy Now! Has always treated the human rights groups in the United States as part of a pro-democracy movement. The way the media talks about pro-democracy movements, it's for other countries, because we've achieved democracy in the United States. And so these human rights groups, they're not part of this larger movement. But you never really achieve democracy. You have to fight for it every single day, and that's what these human rights groups do. And that's why it's critical we have a media that provides a platform for people like all of you to speak out who are the experts in your areas, rather than those pundits we get on all of the networks who know so little about so much, explaining the world to us and getting it so wrong. The Associated Press is reporting some 250 infants, children, and teenagers have been locked up for up to 27 days without adequate food, water, and sanitation at a Border Patrol station near El Paso, Texas, one of our headlines today. One local lawyer said a sick 2-year-old was being treated by 3 girls between the ages of 10 and 15 because no one else was helping him. Children have reportedly been fed uncooked, frozen food or rice, have gone weeks without bathing or clean clothes. Attorney Holly Cooper said, in my 22 years of doing visits with children in detention, I have never heard of this level of inhumanity. This comes as the Trump administration argued this week in federal court that the government is not required to provide toothbrushes, soap, or beds to children who are detained along the border. The Justice Department attorney, Sarah Fabian, made the argument before an incredulous 3-judge panel of the 9th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals in San Francisco. All three judges repeatedly questioned the government's claim. Judge Wallace Tashima said, if you don't have a toothbrush, if you don't have soap, if you don't have a blanket, it's not safe and sanitary. Wouldn't everybody agree with that? Do you agree with that? The Justice Department lawyer said, there is fair reason to find that those things may be part of safe and sanitary. The judge said, not maybe, are a part. What do you say, maybe? You mean there are circumstances when a person doesn't need a toothbrush, toothpaste, and soap for days? The lawyer replied, well, I think Customs and Border Patrol custody, it's frequently intended to be much shorter term. So Judge Marsha Berzon also pointed out the kids sleep on cement floors. She said, are you really going to stand up and tell us being able to sleep isn't a question of safe and sanitary conditions? The Justice Department lawyer said, Your Honor, I think what I'd like to know, she said, not really going to say that, the judge said, and the lawyer responded, I'd like to really focus in on what your question is. And then I want to turn to the protest that's going to be planned over U.S. In other immigration news. A group of Japanese Americans who were once held in U.S. internment camps are planning to protest outside Fort Sill tomorrow on Saturday in Oklahoma. During World War II, the U.S. government imprisoned about 700 people of Japanese ancestry at Fort Sill. There were over 100,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans imprisoned around the United States. Earlier this month, the Trump administration announced it's soon starting to hold migrant children at Fort Sill. And then to Colorado, a case we have followed continuously. Immigrant rights activist Jeanette Vizguera has just been denied an application for a visa in her latest attempt to stay in the U.S., where she has lived for more than a quarter of a century. Earlier this year, Vizguera took sanctuary at the First Unitarian Society of Denver Church after her stay of deportation expired. She had already been in sanctuary in 2017 for 86 days, the mother of 4 kids, 3 U.S. citizens. She was named by Time magazine last year one of the 100 most influential people in the world. She couldn't come to the Time celebration here in New York because she was in sanctuary, and if she stepped foot outside the church, she would be arrested. So I went inside the church to talk to her and her children, and her little 10-year-old boy was going out on a march that day, and he kept his arm tightly wrapped around his mother, and he said, my mother can't go out on the Cesar Chavez march. I must be her voice, the 10-year-old said. But to be able to hear their voices, again, not the know-nothing pundits, that's what will change the world, to go to where the silence is. And as you know, especially working with refugees around the world, it's not often silent where you are, but it is for the corporate media. Those voices do not hit the media radar screen, and it's our job to elevate them. These are the voices that will save all of our humanity. And then moving on to a federal judge in Massachusetts blocking federal authorities from making immigration arrests inside state courthouses. People who come to testify on someone else's behalf, ICE comes to the courthouse and arrests them, which means they will not come. A few months ago, a judge as well as a former court officer were arrested for trying to help an immigrant get out of the courthouse before they were arrested so they could participate in the legal process in the United States. And then you have Honduran President Juan Orlando Hernandez ordering the deployment of 25,000 military forces across Honduras as protests grow, demanding his resignation. Anger against his authoritarian administration has been building for years, but recent unrest triggered in April amidst news of government plans to privatize healthcare, pensions, and education. And we know what this means. With the continued U.S. support of repressive regimes and questionable elections, you have more and more immigrants who try to make their way to the U.S. border. It's absolutely critical we give voice to all of them. And I wanted to end with the suicide rate for Indigenous women soaring as nationwide rate hits post-World War II high. U.S. suicide rates have reached an all-time high since World War II. The overall suicide rate has jumped by 33% since 1999. The crisis is most severe in Indigenous communities. According to the CDC, the suicide rate for Indigenous women has increased to by 139%, for Indigenous men, 71%. Which brings me to our final story, which is the fight for sovereignty over Indigenous land in the United States, and how this relates to refugees. The operator of the Dakota Access Pipeline planning to nearly double its capacity to a point where it could transport nearly all the daily oil production of the nation's #2 producer. Energy Transfer Partners informing North Dakota regulators it plans to expand the pipeline capacity by more than 500,000 barrels per day to as much as 1.1 million barrels. How does that relate? Because it's about climate catastrophe. It's about climate change. And those of you who listen to or watch or read Democracy Now! Know how intensively we covered the standoff at Standing Rock in North Dakota. And I thought I'd end with that story before we move on. In April of 2016, the unofficial historian of the Standing Rock Sioux in North Dakota, named LaDonna Brave Bull Allard, opened her property along the Cannonball River to the, quote, resistance. That's what she called it. She thought a couple dozen people would come. She'd come, set up your teepees or tents on my land, and fight what she called the Black Snake, the Dakota Access Pipeline built by Energy Transfer Partners that would take fracked oil from the Bakken oil fields of North Dakota through South Dakota, Iowa, Illinois, and hook up with a pipeline to the Gulf of Mexico. The indigenous Standing Rock Sioux said no. They weren't different from other North Dakotans. The people of Bismarck, the capital of North Dakota, said no. Their views were respected. Mandan, where the courts and the prisons are, they said no. The prisons where hundreds of indigenous people who were protesting the pipeline were imprisoned. But the people of Mandan had said no, and so they weren't going to build a pipeline there. They were building it next to Standing Rock Reservation. They didn't call themselves protesters. They called themselves water protectors because they were concerned going under the Missouri River, the longest river in North America, that it would endanger the water supply of the 17 million people downstream. They see themselves as protectors of the planet for everyone, fighting for a sustainable future. They see themselves connected to the people of sub-Saharan Africa who must leave their homes because of desertification. To the boy we had on Democracy Now! In Durban, South Africa, from the Maldives, who said, "My country is drowning." Or the people of sub-Saharan Africa who say, "You are cooking our continent." And the indigenous people of this country say, "We're doing it for everyone, so you can stay in your homes and we can stay in ours." So this was the presidential election year in the United States, 2016. The media was almost not covering this historic moment. LaDonna Brave Bull Allard opened her property for a couple dozen people. Hundreds and thousands of people came from Latin America, indigenous tribes, the United States, First Nations of Canada, non-native allies. They opened up one resistance camp from Sacred Stone Camp to the Red Warrior Camp to another, because people saw it as a struggle for everyone. And we felt it was critical to get their voices out. So we went there in Labor Day weekend. This was at the time when in the presidential debates, and we're moving into them right now, not one of the, I won't call them journalists, media personalities, raised the issue of climate change in any of the presidential debates. This, forget Standing Rock, but climate change that affects everyone. Partly why you do the work you do, why you have to do the work that you do. And so we went there Labor Day weekend, and what we found was, people marching in the rural back roads of North Dakota, indigenous women and girls, men. They would hold glasses of water to give to the fully militarized police departments that would meet them with tanks, with MRAPs, with automatic weapons. These were their neighbors. You know the scene, like from Ferguson, years before when Michael Brown was killed and the people rose up, and the militarized police departments of St. Louis met them with full force. This is recycling in America today. You take the weapons from Iraq and Afghanistan and you give them to the local police departments of the United States. That is being fought by many, including former police chiefs who say, how do you think we're going to see our neighbors if we're looking at them through the barrel of a gun? So we covered this, and the next day, a group of Native people went to where they were going to plant their traditional flags. This was an area they considered their sacred burial ground. And they had told this to the judge who would be ruling on whether they could prevent the pipeline from going in this area. And the judge said, if you believe that, give me a map, prove it to me. So they did. And the judge gave the map to Energy Transfer Partners, to Dakota Access Pipeline. And when the tribe got to the area, they had Dakota Access Pipeline, 6 bulldozers already excavating the land, though the judge would be ruling in a few days. And they felt that the company had taken advantage of this moment, taken the map, pulled their bulldozers from other sites, and they were going to destroy the facts on the ground, excavate the area, and the issue would be a moot point when the judge ruled. And they were furious. And they came up on the property and they stood in front of the bulldozers, the women and the girls. I mean, the terrifying scene here. These are earth-crushing machines, massive machines, and it's girls who are 6 and older women and men are standing in front of them. We were filming all of this. We were the only ones there filming, and we just never turned off the cameras. But they won. The people won, and the bulldozers pulled back, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them, and they kept pulling back, and the people marched, and they came from the resistance camp, now hundreds of people, and they're moving forward, and that's when the Dakota Access Pipeline guards unleashed dogs on the protesters. Dogs. And the dogs were biting the water protectors. We were filming a dog, its mouth and nose covered in blood, people who were bitten. They were bitten, they were beaten, they were maced, they were pepper sprayed, but they prevailed at a ridiculously high price for the land, they said, for the water, they said, but they prevailed. And finally, the guards took their dogs, the tractors moved on, the bulldozers got out of the way, and we had this video. And we posted the video online. Now, I'm often invited on MSNBC or CNN, and I say, why aren't you doing more around climate catastrophe? The time to do it is when you give your weather reports to prove that these disparate conditions of drought and freezing cold and floods actually are connected. Why don't the weather people talk about this? That's what most people tune into. And the hosts say, because the executives of our network say, people's eyes glaze over when you say the words climate change. So we posted it online, and within 24 hours, there were 14 million views that showed the lie to the execs. They would drool at getting that kind of response. We flew back to New York, continued to do our coverage that week, and on Thursday, well, we posted and interviewed people like Winona LaDuke, who lives on the White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota, and she said to the governor, you are not George Wallace. This is not Alabama, 1965. We are through. So Thursday, the governor called out the National Guard because the judge would rule the next day, and quietly, though I didn't know it at the time, they issued an arrest warrant for me. I think it had something to do with showing the pictures. So the next day we did our show just down the street from here on Friday. And then my colleague and I flew to Canada. I wasn't fleeing. I was invited to the Toronto International Film Festival because they were doing a special movie, a documentary on I.F. Stone, the great muckraking journalist who said to journalism students, if you can remember 2 words, remember governments lie. If you can remember 3 words, remember all governments lie. And that's the name of the documentary. And they documented, the news organizations were following in his footsteps, so they documented Democracy Now! So we were there to speak after. And the next day I was speaking at University of Toronto. Hundreds of people came out, students and professors, and in the midst of my talk, I got a text that said, you're under arrest. And I didn't know if someone had hacked my phone, someone in the audience, so I'm desperately looking. And I know that, but I do see it's a North Dakota number, so this is probably real. And I also know that if there's an arrest warrant issued for you, you won't necessarily be immediately arrested. But if you have interaction with FBI, police, or border guards, and the arrest warrant's in the system, you'll be taken. And I'm in Canada, and I have to come home. So I just looked out on the crowd and said, could someone call me a cab? I thought I would refrain from telling them what I had just been alerted to so I could just get over the border. Went home to New York and learned it was true, but I didn't take it personally. This was a nationwide threat telling journalists, do not come to North Dakota. So we knew we had to go back and call the authorities bluff. So we flew back to North Dakota. When we landed in Bismarck, they dropped the charges. They announced they would bring stronger charges, since I was in North Dakota, of felony riot, like I'm a one-woman riot. And I called my North Dakota lawyer, not that I had one before, and I said, what does this mean? And he said, it's not the worst thing. I said, okay, just give me a little sense. And he said, maybe a year in jail. I said, a year in jail? How much time do I have? And he said, well, you'll be arraigned in 2.5 days. I said, 2 more days to cover the protests, which we did. And on that Monday morning, we did the broadcast from Mandan outside the prison and the courthouse, so I could just turn around and turn myself in. Well, it was the prison, the courthouse, and the 10 Commandments in between. And I interviewed the chairman of the Standing Rock Sioux, 45th chairman, named Dave Archambault, and said, have you been arrested? He said, yes, at the beginning of this for civil disobedience, low-level, misdemeanor. And I said, and what happened to you? Oh, I was put in an orange jumpsuit, and I was jailed. Strip search, put in a jumpsuit, and jailed. I interviewed Dr. Sarah Jumping Eagle, the pediatrician of the Standing Rock Reservation, and I said, were you ever arrested? She was among the first, because she's most concerned about the kids' health. She said, oh, yes, I was arrested. Low-level misdemeanor. And what happened? I was strip searched, put in an orange jumpsuit, and I was jailed. I mean, how much humiliation can a people take? At the end of the broadcast, we were heading across the street, but hundreds of Native Americans came to show their solidarity. All the media was covering this because, well, a journalist was about to be arrested. It was the homepage of the BBC and Al Jazeera, New York Times, Los Angeles Times. Vogue magazine was covering this. And as I was going across the street, we were told that the judge would not even sign off on the charges against me. And it was not only me. The Native Americans who were facing court that day had their felonies and misdemeanors dropped. This is what happens when the media shines a light in the right direction. This is the kind of reality TV we have to support. This is why we need independent media. And just as I introduced the panel, I want to end with the story, this historic story, as this week we saw in Congress a hearing on reparations in the United States around slavery. Ta-Nehisi Coates, the great writer, testifying for the first time before the House Judiciary Committee. I wanted to just leave you with this story of 1955, the story of Emmett Till, and why the images matter. The 14-year-old African-American boy lived in Chicago. His mother, Mamie, wanted him out of the city for the summer, sends him to Money, Mississippi, and he's living with his aunt and uncle and cousins, and he's sleeping one night, and a white mob comes, rips him out of bed, and he ends up in the bottom of the Tallahatchie River. They said he wolf whistled at a white woman. He was tortured, and he was killed. When his body was dredged up and sent back to Chicago, his mother, Mamie Till, did something incredibly brave. She said she wanted the casket open for the wake and the funeral. She wanted the world to see the ravages of racism, the brutality of bigotry. Jet magazine and other black publications took photographs of his distended, mutilated head, and they were actually published, and they were seared into the history and consciousness of this country. Mamie Till had something very important to teach the media of today. Show the pictures, show the images. Could you imagine if even for just 1 week, the media showed the images of war, of refugees attempting to find safety, show the images of climate devastation? If the top of every radio and TV newscast was the story of a child who died in Afghanistan, we actually learned her name and who her parents were. If the top, above the fold of every surviving newspaper, a woman in Syria trying to make her way to safety, and we actually learned her name because names are so important and their stories are, letting people tell their own stories. If on every tweet, every email talked about a soldier dead or dying, Americans are a compassionate people. They would say, no, war is not the answer to conflict in the 21st century. Democracy now. So, I'm so honored to introduce these guests and hear what you have to say, because you are doing the hard work that must be done. We're going to begin with Jocelyn Kelly, Director for Harvard Humanitarian Initiative's Women in War program, where she designs and implements projects to examine issues relating to gender, peace, and security in fragile states. And I'll leave it there.
I don't know about you guys, but that's a tough act to follow. And I'm not sure I'd agree with much that they say in North Dakota, but one woman riot is about the best description I could imagine. So, wow, thank you for that, and I'll do my best to follow in those beautiful footsteps. So, my name is Dr. Jocelyn Kelly. I direct a program at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative to look at issues related to gender and conflict. And I'm so pleased to be here today, and I just wanted to thank Camille and her whole team, I'm looking for her in the audience, for bringing this together, for bringing us Amy, and for bringing us the opportunity to talk about design-based thinking in the humanitarian space. I thought a lot about how to approach this talk today, and I actually had the privilege of coming straight from a workshop at Interaction. I have a colleague, at least one colleague in the audience here who was there as well. And we were talking to these high-level humanitarians who've been in the field for decades. And we'd mentioned that we were going to come to Fordham for this really unique and innovative way of thinking about the humanitarian space. And they said, sure, we need your designs, but even more than your designs, we need your design-based thinking. And so I just want to exhort all of you all in the audience, and especially the woman who said she wasn't sure if there was a way to switch careers and come into the humanitarian space, wasn't sure if she had anything to offer. The answer is absolutely yes. And thank you for pivoting and bringing that in. So I come from a public health background, which kind of arose out of the field of medical research, which means that this is a field kind of characterized by people who have pen and paper and clipboards, and the conception is that we go around, we talk to populations, and we use those pens and these clipboards, and we write down information, we run away with it, and we think about how to use that information to kind of perpetrate interventions onto the population that we've researched. And I think one of the most important things that we can do now in the field of public health, now in the field of humanitarian action, is how to turn that system entirely on its head and say that is no longer how we are going to think about public health and humanitarian action. My start in the field came when I had responded to the disaster of Hurricane Katrina and was startled and shocked to find that large numbers of incredibly smart, well-intentioned, trained people could look at a disaster situation, think of interventions, take those interventions out, and actually make a situation worse rather than better. And at HHI, one of the things that we are deeply committed to is evidence-based response and how to improve the humanitarian space. My realization that that we don't bring enough science or evidence into how we help people in their most vulnerable moments rebuild from conflict and crisis led me to get a master's in public health and human rights. And during that process, I got an internship in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. When I traveled there, I was set up to learn from a team of nurses, and the nurses were responding to the epidemic of conflict-based sexual violence that was happening in the area. As someone who'd been trained in human rights and public health, I naturally, immediately designed a survey because that's what we're told to do. And the nurses were trying to figure out what the actual problems were and how they could best address these kind of unimaginable needs of these women who'd been through conflict-related sexual violence. So I created a survey, and as one does, it has very neat check boxes, and you kind of get your clipboard and you tick the check boxes about how we can best respond to this problem. And the first day, the nurses went out with these surveys and began to conduct them, and just felt like something was wrong, something wasn't working, and we weren't actually doing the kind of research that we needed to do. And the second day, they went back and tried to give the survey again, and this time I noticed there was like a little bit of writing in the margins. And by the third day, the check boxes had been checked, but there was writing from the nurses across the entire survey, kind of telling the narrative stories of these women, because they felt that our human rights and public health check boxes weren't doing justice to the stories that were emerging from this area. And from that experience, I really took away this idea that we need both qualitative and quantitative methods. We need both narrative and numbers to really understand humanitarian action. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about one of my recent projects in the same area, Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo, where I've worked now for over 15 years. With the same research firm. So until I heard Amy talk, my favorite quote was, poverty is having people read and write about you when you can't read and write yourself. And so we were working with a local Congolese NGO, and they had been tasked by the Congolese government to better understand how to demobilize, disarm, and reintegrate former child soldiers, as well as all of the other vulnerable youth in these conflict-affected communities. So the question became, what is the most appropriate and meaningful way to do this, making youth co-collaborators rather than a researched population, and how to undertake a meaningful research process with youth who had had the opportunity to read and write taken from them by war? So I think the answer is in the process and quality of the engagement rather than in the outcome. And in order to undertake this very sensitive and challenging project, we actually decided to use participatory action research, which is rooted in liberation psychology by Paulo Freire. And what we ended up doing was actually throwing all of the preconceptions out the window, getting all of the project partners who worked with vulnerable youth and had done for decades, and did a launch conference. And we said, well, you know, we as the partners at HHI can tell you a little bit about some research methods and what kind of results come out of those, and some processes that you might find helpful. And you choose from this menu, and we all together make the research questions, make the research methodology, and decide where we're going to go from here together. So from that menu of methods, they decided, yeah, we're going to do key informant interviews, we're going to do focus groups, because that's, you know, a very standard way to approach kind of generating knowledge in these fields. But we're also going to do body mapping and photo voice, which are visual methods. And the powerful thing about this is that visual methods allow populations to viscerally and directly interact with the own data that they're generating, whether or not they've had the opportunity to go to school. So through photo voice, we distributed cameras to the former child soldiers and vulnerable youth, and had them also go to storytelling, meaning-making, and narrative creation workshops, where they were then able to think about how they used visual methods to create their own narratives that they wanted to share with their own communities. Body mapping is an interesting process where you take a huge piece of paper and kind of trace the outline of a human body on it. And then people can point to that human body and talk about the effects of a phenomenon like child soldiering on that person. And on the outside of the body is the social space. So you talk about the social space and how the social arena around child soldiers changes. It was really powerful because these illustrations of this problem became extraordinarily complex and meaningful expositions on how individuals and communities were affected by children being brought into armed groups. There were some kind of rich tapestries of body maps that were created that are these visually striking dictionaries of what is happening to people in this area. And you can go to wecameback.org to look at both the photo essays as well as the body maps. And you had things happening like, just a tiny piece of the map would show a huge child soldier on an oversized chair, kind of standing on the chair doing this, and lots of tiny children cowering under the chair looking up at him. And this was like one poignant, perfect way of illustrating this larger problem that we told the DRC government about, which is that child soldiers are told that being intimidating, powerful, and non-collaborative is literally the only way to survive in your armed group. But in school, being submissive, collaborative, and working with your fellow children is the way to survive in school. But we never kind of mentally demobilize child soldiers. We just put them back into civilian life and hope for the best. So you can see how visual methods actually create a very rich amount of information that can be leveraged in very specific ways. I want to be conscious of time, and so I'll just quickly talk about a project that we are undertaking now with UNICEF that rather than leveraging kind of visual methods themselves, we're leveraging design-based thinking. So about 15 years ago, UNICEF came out with guidelines to say to all the different humanitarian sectors, here's how you can integrate prevention of violence within your piece of the humanitarian puzzle. So if you're making clinics, here's how to make clinics that support and prevent, support people in seeking health care without facing violence. If you're creating latrines, here's how to design latrines without having men and women mix at night in a way that would expose women to the risk of violence. And what has been fascinating about this is we're talking with UNICEF about, one, how to do this better, but two, how to show that undertaking basic violence prevention makes the entire humanitarian response better, more effective, and safer for everyone involved. So imagine we have some great examples of how very simple thought processes starting at the beginning of setting up a camp can change the entire outcome for the populations involved. One classic example is that a nutritional feeding center where starving babies are taken to get therapeutic milk that is enriched was set up along a road that was being constructed. And so you had large groups of bored men who were ostensibly the construction workers hanging out on this road while you had 15-year-old mothers and their babies trying to cross this gauntlet to get to the nutritional feeding center. Guess what? No babies got fatter in that camp. It was such a simple thing to take into account. And without doing that at the beginning of a process, you're just not going to get where you want to get in the humanitarian response. How do you prove it and how do you measure it? Because what you count counts. So if we show that the violence prevention not only is better for women, but also for those babies who really need that nutritional milk, we're going to get further in the humanitarian process. So in closing, I would just say we do need your design thinking. And this is a plea to say let's not only improve the architecture of shelters, but also the architecture of the humanitarian system as a whole. Let's not just improve the design of camps, but let's improve how we design around the dignity and empowerment of those in them. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Paul Dillon, who is managing editor of the International Organization for Migration's Media and Communications Division at its headquarters in Geneva. Responsibilities straddling both news and community engagement sides of MCD's global workflow. He is a Scottish-born Canadian who has spent many years covering conflict zones like Aceh.
Thank you very much. I'm going to make it brief. I hope you don't mind if it's okay if I'll sit. Thanks very much. It's really a pleasure to be here in New York this afternoon. I want to start off with just a quick anecdote to frame this issue of data-driven storytelling and how much things have changed just in a very short period in the last 15 years. So Boxing Day 2004, 30-meter wall of water crashes into the west coast of the island of Sumatra in Indonesia. At that time, I'm a Jakarta-based foreign correspondent covering Southeast Asia and Central Asia. And 2 days later, I'm up in Banda Aceh, which is an old stomping ground for me, a place I'd spent a lot of time in, and the city is unrecognizable. Half the city has basically disappeared, and with it, 170,000 people. Stunning. And as a journalist, and we struggled with this, all my colleagues struggled with this, how do you frame something that's unframeable? You can describe the small elements of these things, the horror on the ground, the resilience of the people, the mourning, et cetera. But at the end of the day, especially the guys on the visual end of things, women trying to frame this for cameras, just impossible to really communicate what that experience was about and the extent to which the destruction had laid waste to Banda Aceh and hundreds of small villages and towns along the coastline. So I spent about a month there, 24/7 news cycle, as it always is for freelancers in those kinds of circumstances. And got it into my head that maybe it was time to start closing the door on a 20-year journalism career and turn the hat around and maybe try and find some work with one of the UN agencies or one of the big international non-governmental organizations. And ultimately, by the end of February, so 7 weeks after the tsunami, I was back up in Banda Aceh, working as the public information officer for IOM. And a funny thing happened. The chief of mission at that time, who's now the regional director for IOM in Southeast Asia, one of the 9 offices that Tina was referring to earlier, took me under her wing. She was the chief of mission for that emergency response and said, whatever else you do, you're going to be my scribe. And you're going to follow me to all these meetings, you're going to join me at all these coordination meetings, and you're going to take notes, and you're going to compress it all, reporting officer's position, right, standard thing. Do your media stuff, that's fine, frame the story, talk to all your contacts, et cetera, but for me, that's what I want you to do. So I spent weeks going every day, twice a day sometimes, 3 times a day to coordination meetings. It was the genesis of the cluster approach. It was just a ton of different meetings over time, which had a funny impact. By month 2, when she decided she didn't want any more of it, I became like the face of IOM somehow at these meetings. And by sort of midsummer, everybody thought I was the chief of mission of IOM, and in fact, I was the most newly minted of employees. But what was really striking at that time was, I mean, I came from a journalism background. I'm about information. I'm about information sharing. I'm about getting out on boots on the ground and asking people questions and figuring out where their biases are and capturing their stories and sharing their stories and editing and figuring out what's important, what isn't important. And I started asking questions about the emergency response and like, how are you gathering data? How are you gathering voices from the field? How are you informing people? How are you asking people where they get information from prior to the tsunami? Who do they trust? It was a war zone, so I mean, many of the standard issue reliable information sources were not reliable. The national media was not considered to be reliable. Many of the religious leaders were seen to be compromised. It's a very devout Muslim part of the country. So those standard things. So it was a real free-flow situation in terms of information gathering, and it became very clear that this was never part of the thinking of most, if not all, of the main UN agencies. Certainly not part of IOM's culture, and big NGOs as well. And when you ask these questions, it's inevitably, well, yeah, I mean, just go out and do your press releases, kid. You know, it's like, we're not talking about press releases. We're talking about reaching into communities and establishing, one, how do they value information, where do they get it from, and how best can we respond to their needs by filling gaps in the information flow, by identifying key actors and key informants on the ground to serve as our megaphones. If you're going to have a drive-through clinic that's going to be in a town for a couple of days, how are you informing people? Well, they weren't. They were just rolling up and waiting for something to happen, waiting for things to happen organically. And it was quite stunning to me to realize, I mean, having watched major UN operations over the years, to see what a disconnect there was, because communications and information was considered to be something that was done by, you know, off the cliff media professionals for the media. Do a press release, share some pictures, that's what it was considered to be. And of course, things have changed quite dramatically in the 15 years since, to the point where here we are today talking about things like data-driven storytelling. It's quite interesting to me as a practitioner now, 15 years deep in the UN system. I was struck by Amy's comment earlier amidst the riot about speaking from our experience, speaking from our own experience. This is something that I think IOM has taken on institutionally in the way that we go and collect and disseminate data, and we tell stories that are data-driven. We are, for those of you who are unfamiliar, I'll give you the elevator conversation. 67, 68 years ago, founded in the ashes of the Second World War to help people return to their countries of origin, those tens of millions who've been driven out by war. Has emerged now as the UN Migration Agency, small A agency, focusing on issues of people displaced by conflict, war, and pestilence, either cross borders or domestically, internally displaced people. We have 173 member states and missions in about 150 countries, so it's a fairly broad footprint. As we heard earlier, about 18,000 employees and contractors all over the globe, heavily decentralized. There are only 300 at HQ in Geneva, where I'm based. A very, very tiny postage stamp footprint at HQ. So we have three main data institutionals, if you like. The first is what we call the displacement tracking matrix. And I'd add, all of this is publicly available. This is all public domain stuff, so you're welcome to plug it into Uncle Google and dig it up for yourself. I don't have a presentation for you, so I can't distract you with pictures and email addresses and URLs and stuff, but take it as given. The displacement tracking matrix is a fascinating place to lose an afternoon or several afternoons drilling into the movements of people around the world. It's a very simple tool. I used it and watched its deployment with my friend Brian Kelly in Nepal a number of years ago following the earthquake. Where are you, Brian? Hi. Which was my first time seeing it operationalized, where you just basically put a bunch of people in the field with clipboards, later with tablets, and they identify all the points where people are living post-disaster, all those points of displacement. They map them out. They go in. They identify a key person within that cluster. It could be 10 families, could be 1,000 families. Gather information about their needs, about what their wants are, where the gaps are, and you use that to create a response plan. So the DTM, as it's known colloquially, is a really powerful data-driven tool that is publicly available and steers not just IOM's responses to situations from Venezuela to Vanuatu, but also is available to our many partners in the field. And we draw down out of the DTM experience to craft and formulate stories to engage the public, to engage practitioners, to engage governments, to engage stakeholder partners, based on where trends are emerging or diverging. Libya, a number of years ago, the mass movements of people in the power vacuum that was created with the collapse of the Gaddafi regime, for example, which predates the DTM, but obviously we're still seeing the consequences of it. Being able to provide a structural, data-based, scientifically rigorous spine to a story that you're selling to the media, or a package that you're using to educate members of a partner government, or indeed to help inform responses by partner agencies in a particular country. It's a really powerful tool. The second is what's called the Global Migration Data Analysis Center, the GMDAC. It's Berlin-based. It's been around for a couple of years now, and it does pretty much what the acronym suggests. It takes aggregated global migration statistics, shuffles them through a number of screens, produces a ton of reports, well thought out, increasingly peer reviewed reports, data driven, that frame the global context and help inform the publications that IOM puts together out of HQ and from the mission levels. And there's information, data's flowing from 150 plus missions in the field, inform the GMDAC, and a knockoff, a part of the GMDAC, which is called the Missing Migrants Project, which is the third of those three data houses, if you wanted to call them that, that's available to you. I encourage you to look at it. The Missing Migrants Project is a unique experience. It is the only open source repository of information and data about migrant deaths and missing migrants around the world. It is a sobering place to spend an hour, one that does not tell the individual stories of the migrant who drowns on the Rio Grande, or who perishes in a vessel that sinks off the coast of Tunisia, or on the journey between Turkey and Greece, or the ferry loaded with migrant workers traveling from Medan in Sumatra to work on a palm oil plantation in Malaysia. But what it does do is it gives you a sense for the scope of the issue, with all the usual caveats about the fact that it is not encyclopedic. It does not account for the thousands and thousands who've died in the Sahara over the last few years making the journey up. We rely on media reports. We rely on data generated by governments. So there are gaps in our knowledge, because in many cases, as Amy was outlining earlier, the media is not telling the story. The mainstream, the brick and mortar media, is not telling the story. So we endeavor to do what we can to try and frame these circumstances by drawing down on the data produced by these three big storage vaults, if you like, the DTM, the GMDAC, and the Missing Migrants Project. And to do so, we've created a couple of different platforms. And I'm not going to take up a whole lot of time explaining all of this because it's all publicly available and we can do it bilaterally. I'm happy to bloviate as much as you want about this stuff. So I'll move relatively quickly through it. Some of you have already had an opportunity to take a look at the Holding On exhibit outside, which is a storytelling platform. I hate to use the word innovation. It makes me a little tingly when people use the term innovation too much. But it is an interesting storytelling platform that engages 360 video to bring people into the room where the woman from Maiduguri, from northern Nigeria, is able to tell her story of displacement, where she's able to explain to you how when the men with the guns came and burned her village to the ground and she fled into the night with nothing on her top, and she found a t-shirt and she pulled that t-shirt over her head and she ran with her children to safety many days, and she kept that t-shirt. She held on to that t-shirt as a reminder of the experience that they had had, and as a reminder and an incentive, indeed, for her to return. Her dream of return, which ultimately is the dream of most migrants displaced in these kinds of circumstances. So the Holding On platform is one place where we've been able to sort of look at particular trends in particular parts of the world based on reportage back from the field, send people in with the basics of a journalist's understanding of the world to drill into the local communities, identify promising storylines, and then work with them to tell their story. It's not the democratization of the story that we would like to see, and I'll explain to you how that fits into some of the other areas, because it's curated. But nonetheless, I think it's a powerful and interesting storytelling tool, one that leverages, I think, more than anything else, the one-on-one relationship that you have with the individual, because you can't show VR to a room full of people. It's just too clunky. We're not there yet, right? But what it forces myself to do, and Rahma and others who go around who travel with Holding On, is to engage with people one-on-one, to answer their questions about what is internal displacement. These refugees they're not refugees. If you're internally displaced, you've not crossed an international border. A refugee is a very precise subset of the broader migration context. So let's talk about migrants in an internal displacement context, and to engage in these kinds of conversations and to fill the knowledge gap that's out there, this profound knowledge gap about a whole range of issues. It's really a door opener, and I think we all know you don't have to be an MA or a PhD in communications to understand that the most effective communication is not sitting watching something on YouTube or something on CNN, or, with all due respect, Democracy Now! It's indeed the one-on-one and the one-on-two and the one-on-three interactions that we have. That's how we affect change. That's how we steer, perhaps, and start to guide the conversation in a slightly different direction. The other two major platforms that we use, the first is called Migrants as Messengers. This is a really interesting, to me it was completely intuitive, but it is in fact one of the maybe the only project of its type within the UN system where we have actually said, migrants, we trust you to tell the story. So there's the camera, you tell the story. We've piloted this in West Africa in 3 different countries. And we've said, well, here's the basic training on how to use a very simple app that I'm going to describe to you a little bit later to capture stories. We get your consent. You tell your story of displacement and migration. In the West African context, of course, sometimes you're talking about internal displacement as a result of a whole bunch of different issues, conflict, pestilence, war, climate change, et cetera, or more frequently, the movements north into the Sahara, up to Algeria, up to Libya, up to Morocco, in this attempt, in some cases, but not all, not even half, where the goal ultimately is to get to Europe. And these people tell their stories. They've returned. They've returned from the circumstances that saw them deeply affected, deeply traumatized by experiences in detention or in the hands of smugglers. And they are there telling their story about what happened to them. And this has caught fire. It has caught fire. I mean, people want to tell their stories. They want to be able to, even the shy, even the introvert has something to, clearly has something to say. And by having the migrant sister sit down with the migrant brother, she with the camera and me with the story, is a powerful moment. And it's an opportunity, to use the term democratize, to democratize the story. We have 8,000 of these stories out there. Arguably, perhaps too many. Nonetheless, because we don't aggressively curate, because we give the voice to the people who ought to have the voice, it's an interesting storytelling platform that again draws down on the data that we've collected in the field and turns those raw numbers about returnees and people who've been held in detention and the victims of sexual violence and so on, and gives them a voice rather than, they're no longer a number. They're no longer 011639. They're Mary or Bob or, or Anthony. So that's Migrants as Messengers, and we're very pleased that not only has it proven its worth in the field, but now there's a significant donor interest about replicating this in other countries. Because I think intuitively you think, if I want to sell you a brand of toothpaste, the most effective voice for that brand of toothpaste is going to be the person who actually uses it. 4 out of 5 dentists recommend. Forget about what the dentists recommend. I want to know what my neighbor recommends, correct? Because I recognize my neighbor. I know my neighbor. It's a friendly face. It's a voice that I recognize. So Migrants as Messengers kind of works on that very simple precept. We have a third one called campaign, which is called I Am a Migrant. And I Am a Migrant is a precursor to Migrants as Messengers. But again, it's a democratization of the space. You say, here is the camera. You are the migrant. You tell us your story. You don't have to do it on video. You can have a simple photograph and a written story. I am Alejandro. I am from here, and I traveled to there, and now this is how I'm contributing. This is my value added to you, skeptical, European host nation of X number of migrants from all over the world. And this is something that, I've used it as a tool in the field on many occasions, and it's extraordinary to see because people stuck in displacement centers, people stuck in camps, they have nothing else but to talk about their circumstances. So if you give them an opportunity and a potentially global audience to do so, you end up with some really compelling storytelling. And that's what you find through I Am a Migrant. And some of them are very uplifting stories. They're success stories. They're the roads are paved with gold stories. Others, much less so. Others are, after I was taken away with the men and used by them for 3 months, I was allowed to leave kind of stories. Because sometimes there's content that needs to be curated because it doesn't make any sense. But the stories are largely allowed to travel along on their own trajectories under their own steam. And I think, again, this is a really powerful way of approaching the storytelling, turning data into stories. So those are our 3 primary outlets. And the app that I referred to, which we've developed in-house with funding that amounts to spider webs and unicorn tears, is called the Community Response app. And what it does is it allows us to start off with, to sit down with a migrant and at the very beginning of the process, get their consent, their informed consent to proceed to the next part of the process, which is to start asking them questions, which is something that's overlooked very often. The media walks to a different set of guidelines, but within IOM and within the UN system and the INGO system, consent is important. And we think we've created the go-to approach to getting informed consent, not just, yeah, I agree, but like the implications are X, Y, and Z. And so you sign off. I think 1 or 2 people in the room here, I think when we're doing Holding On, have worked with me on the Community Response app. So you sign off on it, you answer a couple of questions. It helps the person who's being interviewed to collect their thoughts because they know, I'm going to ask you this, and then I'm going to ask you this, and I'm going to ask you this. And we press a button, and we record their answers, and then we send it. And it goes up to our editors in Manila and in Geneva, who can then cobble it together, your answers to the questions, a little bit of B-roll, meaning the images from around, from the street, from the aircraft, from the ferry, from the camp, from the atrium of the hall here, and we can create a 1 minute or a 1.5 minute or a 1 minute 15 little package that's your voice, disseminated through this app. It's being described by one of my colleagues as the Swiss Army knife of video and consent apps. And as somebody way smarter than me said, puts the power of a supercomputer in the pocket of the kid with the torn jeans sitting dockside in Djibouti, and gives him or her an opportunity to tell their stories as well. If that isn't democratization of storytelling, I don't know what is. Thank you very much for your time.
Next up is Sandra Vines, who is the Director for Resettlement at the International Rescue Committee, has been here at IRC headquarters in New York since 2016, has worked in the field of refugee resettlement since 2004. She was at Church World Service, she was in Turkey, in Ghana, and served in the Peace Corps in Morocco.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Great. So my name is Sandra Vines. Thank you for the introduction, Amy, and I'm the Director for Resettlement, and I just want to tell you a little bit what that means. I'm a humanitarian practitioner who works in the U.S. to ensure that newly arrived refugees receive very high-quality early resettlement services. And I shared the photo that's in the upper right-hand corner of the screen with the 4 individuals. So those are recently resettled refugees that the IRC assisted. And we have a Refugee Voices movement. It's kind of similar to the things my IOM colleague described, with an intent for former refugees to share their own stories so that they can affect change, and notably change in the political arena and in the area of refugee and immigration policy in the US. So I just wanted to share that as a reminder to us that refugees' own stories don't replace, or these data-driven points that we have don't replace refugee stories and the agencies that they have when they tell their own story. That said, data and tech solutions can really help practitioners get better outcomes for refugees. And the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, since its inception in 1980, has been pretty much paper and pen since then. And the whole, 21st century and tech movement seems to have left it by. I just want to give you a quick refresh on the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program. So refugees arrive to the U.S. in a very orderly manner. They're overseas. It takes 2 or more years for them to be vetted. And before they arrive in the U.S., they must have a sponsor. And so that means that agencies like mine, the International Rescue Committee, connects refugees to a city or town in the U.S. So my colleagues have the ability or the power to essentially predetermine whether these refugees' children will be fans of the Baltimore Orioles or the Seattle Mariners. And then things more than that, more immediate consequence for adults, such as will they be able to get a job quickly that pays the bills. And so with this, I just want to link back to a comment that Dr. Kelly made about her last anecdote about the nutritional feeding center, where that's placed within the camp. If it's next to the construction workers, then refugees or those beneficiaries may not thrive in the same way. And so the work that my colleagues do when we place a refugee in a city across the US, we have kind of feel a similar weight of that decision. And we want them to be placed in a city that will be optimal for them and where they will thrive. And when I think about, when you think about the possibilities for my organization, we have 24 cities around the US where refugees can be placed. This includes places like Boise, Idaho, Abilene, Texas. There are refugees going to Missoula, Montana, and of course, Seattle and Baltimore. Most of the 30,000 refugees arriving this year will join a family or friend who they identified overseas. So in that instance, they decide based on who their tie is. However, 35% of IRC's arriving caseload will have no ties, which means that they could be assigned to any of IRC's 23 offices across the US. So how do my colleagues make such a consequential decision? So we rely on a set of experts, so one from each of the 9 resettlement agencies. They get together once a week to determine where to place refugees, which city. They have very deep knowledge of their networks, and they typically give consideration to 3 primary factors when deciding where to place a refugee family. The first is the family size. Is this a single mother from rural Congo with 6 young children, or are these 2 urban Iraqi parents with 2 teenage children? And this has to do with the cost of housing in the US. We all know that wages have stagnated, and the cost of housing, in particular rentals, has gone up. Employability. So it won't come as a surprise to you that the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program emphasizes early self-sufficiency and self-reliance. And so our experts use the sparse details that they have, such as the refugee's age, previous work and reading and writing ability, to determine where they will be best placed. And then the last one is medical needs. So the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, while we value early self-sufficiency, we also accept any kind of refugee, regardless of their ability to work. So we do receive cases with intensive medical needs, maybe a child who needs a certain kind of pediatric surgery shortly after arrival, and they need to go to this town because they have, that clinic or that hospital that specializes in that type of surgery. So intersecting the 3 factors are considerations of 2 things: housing availability and employment. And so placement experts keep careful records on employment rates and the cost of housing. To complicate things further, the State Department, who is our government funder, places a cap on how many refugees can arrive to a certain city during a 12-month period. So when a location is full, if Seattle has reached its capacity, then I have to consider a different location in the US. So the placement experts consider these factors and more, but in cities where there are hundreds of refugees arriving generates a number of possibilities that is really too difficult for any individual to optimize. So this is the problem. The solution. Enter Duncan Lawrence and our partners from Stanford Immigration Policy Lab, who developed a matching algorithm for refugee placement. So I'm just going to sketch out a little bit what it does from a practitioner's point of view, and then Duncan is going to go into more of the details. So for the past year and a half, the IRC and another colleague agency have been working with Stanford to improve our placement process and refugee outcomes. The algorithm that Stanford developed creates a system that supports the placement experts in assigning refugees to different US communities so as to maximize their integration outcomes while taking into account capacity constraints such as limited housing. The matching algorithm uses historical data and individual outcomes to predict employment probabilities for new refugees at all locations through mapping and matching cases to locations to maximize employment. So the initial results are very promising. We found that it improved outcomes by about 45% for refugees. At the IRC, we're really eager to utilize this algorithm to enhance the economic outcomes and overall lives of resettled refugees. all the more that the algorithm is flexible to work with any preferred integration outcomes for which data exist. So perhaps in a later iteration, we could think about youth, for example. What is a positive integration outcome for youth? Does that mean that they've graduated high school? How can we use this in ways that goes beyond just the employment marker? So that's what I wanted to say, and I wanted to kind of lay some of the groundwork for my colleague to go more into detail about this work. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And by the way, as we're meeting here, President Trump has just directed U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents to conduct a mass roundup of migrant families that have received deportation orders. The operation is likely to begin with pre-dawn raids on Sunday in major U.S. cities. He's calling it the family op, like family operation. It's slated to target up to 2,000 families in 10 U.S. cities, including Houston, Chicago, Miami, Los Angeles, and other destinations. So that's upcoming. As we go right now to Duncan Lawrence, Executive Director of the Immigration Policy Lab at Stanford University, where he leads a team building innovative tools and evidence to foster the the integration of immigrants around the globe, has worked in Latin America and in Colorado, and has published in top journals like Science and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Yeah.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? So I'll try to do three things. I'll tell you a little bit about what we do at the Immigration Policy Lab in terms of data and storytelling. Talk a little bit about people in place and the importance of place for refugees, using a story with a name, which I don't often do because most of the time I'm just looking at data. And then I'll talk a bit more in detail about the algorithm that we've been working on with a variety of resettlement agencies in the US, including the International Rescue Committee, and a number of countries in Europe as well. And so at the Immigration Policy Lab, I usually say three things. We design, discover, and train. So we work with frontline service providers, practitioners, and government agencies to design new policies and programs and go out and test them. We also do work around discovering whether or not existing policies and programs had the effect that people thought they would, and perhaps they didn't, or they did, or they were not effective. And so we do quite a bit of evaluation work on major programs and policies. And we also train graduate students in social science and data analysis, hopefully so that they don't go off and end up working on improving click rates, but use their data skills to address humanitarian, social, political, and economic problems. And so I think storytelling in general comes in an incredibly diverse set of forms, and I don't think data storytelling is any different. And at the Immigration Policy Lab, we really focus on a particular type of storytelling using data, and that's really to try to understand through data analysis the impact of programs and policies. So trying to figure out whether something had an effect or not. And that's the sort of type of storytelling that we most often do. And so I'll give you just a few examples of that across a couple of different spaces. And so we do a wide variety of work, not just thinking about refugees, but undocumented immigrants as well as what we call new citizens, which might be economic migrants or long-term migrants that don't fall into the sort of undocumented or refugee category. And so some of the work we've done around discovering policy effects has to do with DACA, and so looking at the intergenerational effect of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. So although DACA recipients were kids when they arrived in the United States, for instance, most of them have aged into adulthood at this point and are parents themselves. So we evaluated the effect of DACA on the health and well-being of children of mothers who were eligible for DACA, and found a 50% reduction in health outcomes such as stress and anxiety disorder among kids who had DACA eligible mothers versus those that weren't. We've done evaluations of policies that provide undocumented immigrants with driver's licenses, which any of you are from New York. That has been a topic of this week. And so we did an evaluation of California's policy, and that's been part of the policy conversation here in New York in terms of thinking about the impact of driver's licenses on traffic safety. And so I'm going to turn to, I'll make an argument to you that place really matters for refugees, give you one example, and then talk about the algorithm that we've been working on and how it operates a bit. And so the story I'll tell is, it's not mine, but it's sort of mine. After World War II, there were a number of individuals in Hungary, hundreds of thousands of them, who were anti-communist and ended up getting blacklisted. So they basically needed to flee in order to avoid violence and persecution by the communist regime. One of those individuals ended up coming to the United States. His name was Emil. And my grandmother signed up at her local church to host a Hungarian refugee for 2 weeks. So the idea at the time was that the resettlement program in the United States would be congregations hosting individuals. In 2 weeks, people would find their footing and live happy lives in the US. Emil ended up living with my grandparents for 2 years. And so he became a member of my family. He moved from Boston to Long Island. He became a music teacher, got married, had 2 children, Vic and Phil, who largely became my uncles. And so I often think about sort of what in social science we call the counterfactual, which is what if Emil had ended up somewhere else? So he didn't end up in Boston. He didn't end up with my grandparents. He didn't have a place to live for 2 years and only had a place to live for 2 weeks. And so place for Emil, I like to think, mattered a tremendous amount. And so Sandra's sort of outlined for you the US resettlement program, in which a group of experts do have the ability to make a decision about where refugees end up going in the United States. So they have a choice about what place refugees end up in. And that choice can have a significant impact on outcomes for refugees. And the US resettlement program is not alone in this choice that a group of experts have. So other countries like Switzerland, they send asylum seekers to cantons to actually await their asylum decision. And those individuals don't necessarily have any control over the canton that they're sent to. In the Netherlands, caseworkers, after asylum seekers actually receive their permit, so they're now permit holders, caseworkers make assignments across the Netherlands to labor market regions. And so asylum seekers in the Netherlands end up finding housing, usually in a municipality in which they've been assigned by a caseworker. And so in various countries throughout the world, I would argue that there is a bit of a lack of choice that refugees have and asylum seekers have. I don't think that's an ideal situation, but it is the way that governments currently operate many of their programs. And so working with IRC and the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, we held a set of workshops to have a conversation around, are there mechanisms through which we might be able to improve the placement process? And I think Sandra has highlighted sort of the key issue, which is if you've got thousands of refugees coming in who you can locate in 20 different cities, it's cognitively difficult to figure out that matrix in a way that's going to ensure that that person gets to a place where they're most likely to be supported, most likely to find work, and most likely to integrate. And so the algorithm that we've developed tries to leverage the historical data that's available around asylum seekers and refugees to get a better sense of a match between an individual and the place that they might be sent. And then that algorithm can provide a recommendation to a placement officer, in the Canadian context, the destining officer, who then can accept, use that information, or they can also make an expert choice, which is that I'm not going to send the person to the place where they might have the most likelihood of finding employment based on sort of this algorithmic match, but there are other needs for that individual that come before whether or not, in the US case, that person is employed within their first 3 months of arrival. And so what we've tried to do in designing the system is to make it both flexible so that it's human controlled, in that placement officers always have an ability to make the final choice about where a refugee or asylum seeker is destined, but that it's also really flexible. And so part of that story is that not every government wants to just try to maximize employment outcomes. And so you can imagine if we had a holistic measure of integration that we knew for every refugee a year after they had arrived in a country. In my view of things, that holistic measure that's multidimensional, captures psychological, economic, social integration, would be a much superior measure than just looking at employment. We built the sort of system so that it eventually can accommodate that type of outcome, and then match people to places based on sort of broader integration and not just employment outcomes. I think progress is iterative, and so we think of this tool as a first step in terms of helping placement officers and ultimately refugees and asylum seekers end up in places where they're most likely to be successful. The ideal world, at least from my perspective, is that refugees and asylum seekers should have more voice in this system. So Sandra's highlighted that if you do have a US tie, for instance, so you've got a family member or friend that's identified, you're gonna go and live in a community that's nearby them, most likely. But for those refugees that are what we call free cases, they may end up in a city that they didn't choose. And so one of the things we've been working on is combining sort of refugee preferences with outcome-based matching, which is that refugees would be able to weigh in on the type of community that they wanted to live in, and we'd also be able to try to match them simultaneously to a community where they're most likely to be successful. So to create some balance in that system about refugee voice, as well as trying to ensure a high level of integration and make sure people are matched to a place where they're most likely to be successful. And I'll leave things at that.
Thank you, Duncan. And we will wrap up with, and then take audience questions. We'll wrap up with Erica Way, Senior Data Visualization Developer with the Center for Humanitarian Data. Her piece is the key example of data to story for people to, it's called Displaced in South Sudan, a journey of 1,000 kilometers.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Erica Way. As Amy said, I'm a database developer for...
Speak right into the microphone.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you could even take it out and hold it up to your mouth. Yeah, I think if you put it right, like eat it.
So I'm a database developer for UN OCHA's Center for Humanitarian Data, which is based in The Hague. The center was started in 2017, which is around the time that I joined. And prior to that, I was a design technologist at Frog Design, which is a global design firm. Since joining the center, my work mainly focuses on creating custom data viz around topics like migration, internal displacement, and other crises around the world. One of the main goals of the center is to increase the use and impact of data in humanitarian response. So one of the ways that we hope to achieve this is by making data more accessible to decision makers who may or may not be data savvy. And one of our signature products is HDX, which is the Humanitarian Data Exchange. This is an open platform where you can find and share data across all humanitarian sectors. Since its launch, we're now sharing over 9,000 data sets from close to 300 different humanitarian organizations. So some of the projects that we work on are creating data viz dashboards, like the project that Paul mentioned, Missing Migrants. We built a dashboard tool using that data where you can filter based on origin of a migrant or the destination, and you can see what happens to them along the way. Another one, which Amy mentioned, and you can see a visual behind me, is a data story we put out last year about displacement in South Sudan. This is a story about one family and what happens to them when they're forced to leave their home in their journey of over 1,000 kilometers. I worked on this with a data journalist by the name of Hao Yun Su, who's based in Beijing. She was a data fellow at the center at the time, and she researched data from the OCHA South Sudan office, from IOM, and from the IDMC, and put together the story of this family and what happens to them. And one way that we try to relate this to people who might be reading about this is the idea of using a step counter. So most of you are probably familiar with Fitbits and Apple Watches and tracking your daily steps. So in this journey, we show each section and the distance they have to cover and how many steps that is. So this family's journey was 600 miles. It's about 500,000 steps. It was a course of over 200 days. So as a database developer, I think being able to visualize data is a good way to show a complex data set. And being able to create a narrative around data allows you to give it context and to give it some meaning. I think one of the panelists from earlier this morning talked about big numbers and how big numbers can create a mask and, anonymity. So being able to use a tool like a data story to convey a human experience like this family, which is really, more than statistics, it's more than just charts. So it's a way to give meaning to the data, because I think data on its own doesn't really have a lot of value. It's the way that you use it that you can give it more value. Thank you.
So why don't we open the floor to questions? Thank you, everyone here, for your input. I have a question. If any of these tools are being used along the border as people make their way up from Latin America? Any of the apps or tools?
Well, I mean, certainly the Missing Migrants Project would be tracking media, governmental and departmental reports on migrants who have disappeared on the journey north, regardless of whether the point, but that would up to and including the United States border.
Always up for question. Deborah Rogers again. Thinking about my thesis, and I called it Pieces of the Puzzle and Peace Building in the 21st Century, and I incorporated interestingly enough, the storytelling, the person-to-person, peace in your pocket, the concept of data, the concept of the rising power of China in terms of going 5G, et cetera. But this concept of seeing it like a puzzle, do you all have teams that are integrated? When we think of like an ideal team would have for example, a philosopher, a musician, an architect, a data scientists. I'm just thinking of an ideal concept of a team, especially when designing things that are beautiful, like amazing processes that help people. Do you have integrated teams, or do you typically work with teams that are sort of narrow? That interests me a lot, having been a clothing designer and having had very broad teams. I don't know how it works in this field quite yet.
Sandra?
Sure, I can take a stab at that from a practitioner's perspective. Most of our time, at least within U.S. programs at the International Rescue Committee, is spent serving clients. We do have a research analysis and learning team, which is a bit unusual for a national resettlement agency. And we also have a full-time technical advisor whose job is to sort of monitor and evaluate and think about the work that we're doing in order to, there's kind of two branches. One is to put out thought leadership, and the other is just to see how are we doing when we measure ourselves against ourselves. But I think that we rely a lot on partnerships, such as the one that we have with Stanford, and you know, those are very rich because I think you can really marry the two sides, the practitioner side and the data analyst and design side.
I'm going to make a shameless plug for our team. We have two wonderful colleagues from HHI, Sierra and Michael here. Michael is an architect and is now working with big data and storytelling. Sierra is kind of a data magician. I don't know. If you guys go to their workshop at 4:45, I think they're kind of thinking about some of those like really integrated ways of thinking. And I do know that integrated teams can bring a lot of like really remarkable new ways of seeing the information and processing the information, which is invaluable. But in academia especially, we always talk about interdisciplinary work, and I think, you know, when it comes right down to it, it's harder than you think, and people can be a little uncomfortable with it, and we're still trying to figure out the best way to handle that.
And I mean, from our side, you know, no musicians and artists on the teams, but certainly the way that you collate and display data to drive your stories is clearly, it's an aesthetic. So it's something we pay a lot of attention to, and maybe probably could do a better job of it, maybe with the assistance of the kind of people that you're talking about. And the other part of it where it dovetails with what you're asking about is on the sort of user experience of using things like our app or these platforms that are publicly available. If it's not intuitive, if it's not simple, if it's not clean, if it's not pretty, then people aren't going to use it. So within the design aspect of these, the nuts and bolts of design, we have to, we've learned from hard experience that we have to incorporate an aesthetic as well.
We try to make an effort to do more than just give lip service to the interdisciplinary front. And so often there are folks from different fields who are engaged in our projects. I think one of the things about being in a university setting is that we can engage particular specialties on sort of short term. They may not be inclusive to the project in terms of seeing it from its beginning to its end, but engaging with an ethicist or a philosopher around sort of the use of algorithms and getting their feedback on those things. Having a community to bounce ideas off of, that I think is often unique to university spaces and has been really useful for IPL in terms of all the things that we've worked on that I often think sort of need that additional perspective.
At the center, we're a distributed team of data scientists, designers, and developers. We also have a program called the Data Fellows, which is a program where we invite data experts from outside of the humanitarian sector to come to the Hague for a couple of months and focus on a certain area. So this year, we have some data fellows from statistics background, business strategy, and a couple of others.
Hi, I had a question just out of curiosity for the Missing Migrant Project, but also just collecting data in general from governments that are not as strong enough or don't keep accurate information, especially around migration out of, well, from Asia to Gulf countries, where the receiving and the sending countries are not really keeping accurate data, but also the receiving countries don't want to give their data out because of all of the complexities there. How do you manage having, like staying within a good margin of error or having accurate data when those are the complexities that we have to deal with?
That's an excellent question, and I would stir another aspect into that, another challenge, which is that the act of migration is so often an act that doesn't occur in the public space, as it were. It's a clandestine act, if you want. So which further complicates things. And I'll give you an excellent example of this that came up a little while ago. AP did some excellent reporting out of Southern Africa about 9 months ago on migrant deaths, individuals migrating into South Africa to find work. And there are mass graves along the border, both sides of the border, for people who just didn't make it. These are not factored into our reporting on missing migrants because they were never reported missing. They don't appear on any government database. They were never reported in the media. And so clearly, I mean, it is in bold print on missing migrants that, there are plenty of caveats. This is not, should not be considered, the end of the road when it comes to the data. This is the publicly available data. This is the information that's available through our partnerships with the media and through those that are available through governments. Now, in situations where governments are unwilling or unable to provide accurate data, we have an issue. But it's an issue that all we can do with that is to flag it as, we can't say with certainty that, the reporting out of parts of the Caribbean, for example, will stand high scrutiny because vessels are leaving. We're conscious of vessels leaving and not arriving, but again, there's a gap in the reportage. What we really need is, is the ability to pursue an investigative role in these kinds of situations where vessels do go missing or train loads of migrants disappear or whatever. But that's something that's well beyond IOM's mandate, and indeed is not something that many of the member states, I think, would be supportive of. So it's really important to understand the shortcomings as well as the advantages of that particular platform.
Sort of a question more maybe for Amy, for when you were talking about what's happening even in the United States, let alone other places, is that there's such an overload of information and problems and issues and numbers and data. But I've been thinking a lot about that there needs to be citizens and there needs to be boots on the ground, and there seems to be not enough information about how to gather that together so that we go one place and show what they did in Hong Kong and in other places. We need boots on the ground. And wondered, how do you do that?
What do you mean by boots on the ground? You
Citizens.
mean citizens doing what?
Gathering and showing that this cannot be accepted. This is not acceptable.
Well, there are many who do that. For example, No More Deaths is an organization along the border that helps migrants who are coming over in the, harsh Sonoran Desert. And Scott Warren was just on trial for 20 years, a geologist, a professor in Arizona, because he was helping migrants. The Customs and Border Patrol, they took videos of them, dumping thousands of gallons of water that they leave in the desert. And they were so angry, once again, at the images that they arrested him, though he wasn't the one who took those pictures that day. Also, these volunteers that go along the border are often the ones that find the dead bodies and the bones of migrants.
But there needs to be more of us going down.
Yeah. That will be up to you. What we can do in the media is cover what you do and make sure that voice is given to what people are doing. It'll be interesting to see what happens this weekend as these mass roundups take place on Sunday. Did you want
My name is Boris. I'm just curious from a data philosophy perspective. Having been in the space of refugees, there's a high scrutiny on protection and anonymity. So I'm curious about two sides of that question. One, by collating numbers, you are hiding some of the stories that people don't want to necessarily be revealed. So what are your thoughts around privacy that you want to preserve for the people whose information you're collecting? And on the flip side, when you do want to democratize access to this information and make it available and visually appealing and informative rather than just data, how do you also consider options that some of the data will not be used for the good, but some of the data sets may be used for storytelling, especially in the nationalistic environment that we live in, that the stories can be crafted using this data? So what do you think about this?
Well, I can take a run at the second part of your question, maybe. Look, information is dangerous. Data is dangerous. There's no silver bullet in terms of, controlling how information is going to be used, how you can frame a story, and yeah, it can be dissected and turned on its head. And I mean, we have to be very conscious because I mean, in the unit that I'm working with, I mean, we are the public-facing end of a global organization. So we are extremely cautious about filtering out stories that we feel could blow up in our faces, that could be used, even righteous, interesting stories that could be turned around and used against us. But I think, or used against migrants or policy or a whole range of different things, not just against IOM. But I guess the addendum to that is to the best of our ability, we try and ruggedize the storytelling by ensuring that the core of it, when we're using data, it's incontrovertible. It's not a question of if or perhaps. It's like, there's the numbers. You can't argue with, you can argue with the numbers if you want, and you can recycle them, but I guess it's having that rigid, scientifically verifiable data core that's your skeleton. And then the story is just the meat that fills out your skeleton. That's what we're looking for. The tighter you make the package, the more ruggedized it is, and the less likely it is that it's going to be unspooled and used by people who have a different agenda.
Well, Sandra, do you want to work up?
I just wanted to add one quick thing on the question of privacy. I think from the IRC's perspective, we hold a ton of client information. So we have thousands upon thousands of refugee records who we've resettled over the years, including their social security card numbers, lots of very sensitive information, and we take that very, very seriously, so that when we do engage in research, we make sure that data is anonymized, that we have permission to share it, all of the ethics and compliance steps that you take when engaging in this area. It's also important, I think, because we've lagged a little bit behind technologically, having these safeguards in place is so important.
Well, we want to thank you all. Oh, one last question. You can just shout it.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
All right, Jean-Michel, I have a project for IOM America where we do storytelling and story sharing in school around the country, migrant youth telling their stories. And in some way it has become a bit of this archiving that you're talking about, right? And to link the discussion of this morning to this kind of storytelling that we're talking about, this morning a lot of the people on the panel talked about the importance of involving the community into the design of those camps. In some ways, the storytelling is a way of involving the community, the migrants, into telling us who they are. Right? It's a lot about the past, where they come from, right? What they might have lived. A lot of the stories are about what they're facing today. The act of telling the story is an empowering act. How much of the collecting, I guess, I'm trying to get to the question, right? Collecting, archiving, how is the storytelling then become action? How, from your experience, where have you seen that move from story take while telling their own stories?
Yeah, Jean-Michel, I think that's such an interesting question. And, in participatory action research, the process is like the empowerment, it is the outcome. And one of the things that we did with the Project for Vulnerable Youth in DRC is at the end, when all of the communities had created their own data that they could interact with, we made something we called mobile museums, where the project ended in rainy season. So we laminated all of the photos, all of the body maps, all of the takeaway messages, put them in architects' rolls, covered them in plastic, and the project partners went from every community that had participated, they brought back not only their own data, but the data from all of the other communities and put it up in churches, community centers, and had dialogue around the fact that this was not a solitary process to lose youth to armed groups, to lose youth to terrible violence, and to connect with that shared experience was incredibly powerful. And one of the most important ways to heal from trauma is to make meaning of both your past and your present. And I think just to say yes, everything that you're doing, I think your answers in your question in the sense of what does it mean to tell a story? I think it means to understand your own, kind of where you're going with that, and to know that you're not alone in some ways as well. So congratulations on what sounds like wonderful work.
And that is a wonderful way to end. I also want to encourage people, if you have ideas for stories, people's stories that you think that they want told, you can always write to us at stories@democracynow.org. Thank you so much to the panelists. Thank you to much all of you, and keep up your brilliant work.
And thank you, Amy. Watch your head. You're sort of shoved in there. If you look at your programs, we now go into the breakout sessions. There will be interns out who can point you in the right direction. And then we'll return here at 5:45 for Angela and Alberto to wrap this all together in a nice, clean package. Okay? Thank you. Thank you, panelists.